Hello and welcome to my Magicka Warden damage dealer guide for the Wrathstone patch. This is a bit different from the other guides I did because most of them are off meta. I don't claim that anything of that is like best in slot in terms of single target DPS. In this guide I want to showcase how large the difference is depending on which gear you use. So for one setup I'm gonna go through gear that is usually, it benefits the group. It's basically the standard gear that you have, and the other one is how much DPS you gain on a stationary dummy and bosses that are similar to that basically don't require that much movement when you go for the highest single target damage possible. Difference is quite big, I can say that for now, but in general it's more about the rotation of Magicka Wardens that you can use. It's a very easy and almost static one, which you have to make some sacrifices for it, but in the end it yields very comparable DPS to what you gain with other rotations that I've seen so far on the Magicka Warden, so it's pretty good. And given how easy it is to perform that rotation, it's definitely usable, especially in more difficult trials when you want to learn something new, or even dungeons. It has a lot of AoE damage, puts out some debuffs for the group and stuff, so it's very nice. It gives Major Slayer to allies at range, which is something that the Magicka Warden is the only spec that can actually do that, where you don't have to go into melee range to provide it. So it has some advantages compared to other classes, even though we don't see a lot of Magicka Wardens in groups, especially not in endgame groups, because they do not provide enough to justify using it. Nightblades usually can also provide Major Slayer, they just have to go in melee range, which isn't the problem in most cases. And but still, Magicka Wardens are a lot of fun to play. They deal a lot of damage, more than most people give them credit for. And again, they are a pretty unique class in terms of rotation, especially the Magicka version is quite interesting, how the rotation can play out in that scenario. And yeah, we're gonna go through all the gear, skills, CPs, and the rotation in detail, and then I'm gonna show 3 different parses. One is with the best in slot gear setup on live that I have now. The second one is with a different spammable, so one is with elemental weapon, the other one is with the cliff racer, and the third one is using the cliff racer and the usual more common and more accessible gear that is easier to obtain, and just to showcase how different the parses are if you use different gear, and how impactful gear can be if you want to provide the best DPS for your group. Alright, let's start with the gear. Gear is always situational. I want to say that first. So sometimes you can use Sorcery, for example, if you don't have to move that much. Sometimes it's not really beneficial, even though it's not hard to have it be on par with other sets. It depends on how good you are at keeping the stacks up. So the main 5-piece that we're using on this one is either Necropotence. This is a fluid, flexible one where you can move as much as we want. As long as you keep the netch on, you get the full benefit. And the other one is the perfect Sorcery. This one is, as I said, more situational. It gives you 1096 maximum Magicka, so 1/3 basically, roughly, of Necropotence already covered by that, and then you only have a gap of like 2k Magicka that you need to cover with Sorcery, which is roughly, let's say, 6 to 7 stacks on average. So if you can get these, Sorcery is already gonna match Necropotence. So you don't need to get the full effect for Sorcery to be better, but in case you need some more bursty damage, in case you need to move a lot, Necropotence can outperform Sorcery. On a static dummy it will not, though. Simply because Sorcery at some point after like 7-8 seconds it starts outperforming Necropotence in terms of damage output, and after that it increases to 600 spell damage and that 1096 maximum Magicka in the perfect version. If you do not have the perfect version, of course you have to generate more stacks to make it comparable to Necropotence. With the non-perfect version, it already requires you to have roughly 10 or let's say 11 stacks to outperform Sorcery, to outperform Necropotence, so it's a lot more difficult to actually get that in a raid. Consider that when you make up your build. Don't always use Sorcery, it's not always going to be better than Necropotence. It depends on whether you have the perfect version or not and how much you have to move in a fight. The monster set I use two different ones. The Lumbers one is still purple, but it doesn't matter. Ideally, you'd be using Domi House or Vulcan Scoria. You have a lot of different options for the monster set. If you don't want to go into melee range, you can either use two one-piece sets, or you can use Vulcan Scoria. Both of these will net you roughly the same DPS, while Vulcan Scoria gives you a little bit more health, which can also be quite nice. If you allow yourself to go in melee range, if your group is stacked a lot behind the boss, or you have single targets you have to focus down very quickly, then Zaan is pretty much the best option you can go for. So basically, if we put this on, it deals a lot of damage over a pretty short period of time. It basically, in Cloud Rest, if you go downstairs, you want to burst down those crystals. Zaan is a very nice option because it basically kills one by itself without requiring you to do a lot on it. So it's a very nice option, and as I said, you have a lot of options. Vulcan Scoria is ranged and procs off your damage over time effects, which is also very nice, and you get a little bit more health, so if you feel like you need it, then in some raids, Asylum and Cloud Race, the harder ones, you can go for Ice Heart, because it gives you just so much damage mitigation through the shield. There's a lot of options. You can go for whatever you like best. If you want to scratch out the maximum single target DPS, Zaan is what you have to go for. We could technically consider other options, such as Mother's Sorrow or something, but Necropotence, especially since it now gets affected by the CP buff, is just better. The maximum Magicka you have here, the 3150, is affected by the 20% CP buff now, which is additive with the rest. So it's basically equal to a roughly 4k Magicka, which is definitely better than the crit chance you get from Mother's Sorrow, for example. Necropotence on a Warden is very easy to keep up, because basically you have the bear active all the time, and on top of that you have the Netch, so in the end you don't have any issues keeping this up. The bear doesn't die anymore in PvE unless you go into Maelstrom Arena, which is a different topic. So in the end, this is pretty much a safe bet. It gives you very high damage. The Max Magicka influences all damage you do besides enchantments, which is basically the only advantage that going for Mother's Sorrow, for example, has, because it also boosts your enchantment damage from the Absorb Magicka and Flame damage enchantment. But still, these, in overall, the additional maximum Magicka affects your other damage by so much more that it makes sense to run Necropotence in this case. These are basically the two main set options. The other ones, on jewelry and the weapon, you have, for once, you have Master Architect. Master Architect on a Warden is nice because it basically is usable on range. So even if I stand like 20 meters away, my bear is going to be on the boss, and if I activate the low cost ulti, I'm going to get that 10 second of Major Slayer, and the ranged DDs around me will also get that. So Magicka Warden is pretty much the only one that can reliably keep this up at range, which is the key takeaway of Magicka Warden in a group. But still, there are some issues with it, because you have to drop another set for it, for the Master Architect, and the opportunity cost in terms of how much, for example, Spell Strategist provides is very high. And that gets us to the other option that you have, which is Spell Strategist. Master Architect affects everything you do. It affects AoE damage too. It gives your allies a nice buff. And the other, so this is basically for all situations where you are in a trash scenario, in trash fights, where you are in a case where you want to buff your allies more. Master Architect is what you can go for. And in case you need you need to burn the boss pretty quickly. If you're in a high-end group, you want to burn St. Olms before one of the mini-bosses even enrages, or basically after Lothis dies. You want to kill the main boss before Films enrages, or you want to focus one of the mini-bosses down in Cloud Rest or in Asylum, for example. You can use Spell Strategist because it just gives you that burst damage that you need in that case. And 4 seconds is pretty much... you can change targets pretty quickly with this, because 4 seconds is not a long window, and you usually don't change targets that often, that fast usually. And this set still has a tooltip bug. It says this effect can occur every 5 seconds, but it's 4 in the end. So it's not as bad as it sounds here. So on jewelry and weapons, the two options are either Spell Strategist and Master Architect. Of course, you can also front bar a different set if you want something that is easily buyable. Go for Mother's Sorrow, for example. Necropotence and Mother Sorrow is a solid beginner option. You can buy all the gear you have, you only need to farm a monster set. And the last piece of gear you need is a Maelstrom Staff. I have an infused Maelstrom Inferno Staff on this one. This basically you need on all builds, simply because it's the best damage option you can have on the back bar. In the end, if you don't have it, it's not the end of the world. You can still do more than 40k DPS easily, which is enough to finish all content in the game, even the hardest trials. No worries about that. It's just better to have it than not to have it. Skill-wise, the front bar looks basically pretty much crowded with animal companion abilities, and the reason is the, let's say, advanced species passive. This one increases your damage done by 3% for each animal companion ability slotted, so you want to maximize your front bar uptime, and you want to put as many animal companion abilities here as possible, because in that case you get a lot of damage out of it. 15% damage done is quite a lot. It is additive with all the other damage done that you have, so it's not as much as it sounds, but it should still be like an 8 to 9% damage increase just from having all of these abilities slotted on the front bar. So we have the Blue Betty, which is a sustain one. It doesn't cost anything. It purges a negative effect from you, can also be helpful. It gives you a lot of sustain, almost 200 per second if you keep it up. So this is one you definitely want to have. If you need a shield on the front bar, I suggest putting this on the back bar and put a shield on the front bar. Otherwise I'd put the shield on the back bar and be done with it. The next one is a spammable. You can either use Screaming Cliff Racer here if you know that your debuff uptimes in the group are going to be good, because then the Cliff Racer starts outperforming Elemental Weapon on a Warden. Especially if you're a bit more further away from the target, it deals more damage based on how far the enemy is. So if you're far away, like in Asylum for example, Cliff Racer is a very, very good option. Then we have the Sharks. This is the main ability that we focus on. And as you can see here, I have it highlighted pretty large on my screen, simply because you want to keep that ability up as much as possible. As you can see, the tooltip is huge. It applies Major Breach to everything it hits. It doesn't cost more than a spammable. It costs the same as the Fetcher Infection or a spammable. So this one is pretty insane. It's the same as on a Stamina Warden. It hits for a shit ton. You definitely want to keep this ability up as much as possible, which is why our rotation centers around this ability. The next one, the Fetcher Infection, is our strong single target dot. It doesn't do anything besides doing damage for us. And every second cast of this ability deals 50% increased damage. So we can either cast this twice per rotation, but I don't recommend that, because if you add up to 50% increased damage on this, you get roughly the same damage as a tooltip of this one. So it's basically, it's best to just cast it once every rotation and get the additional damage every second one. As long as you keep this up 100%, it's still gonna be good. So we're casting this once per rotation. This one we want to keep up. Alright, let's get to the back bar. The back bar looks a bit weird. Here, the interesting thing is that on this build we only use 2 back bar skills, which is Winter's Revenge, the AoE, and Blockade of Fire. Now, some people might see this and say, yeah, why don't you use Rearming Trap? Why don't you use Channeled Acceleration to get a bit more, get a bit of minor force in? You can definitely do that, and I recommend doing it in some instances, especially Cloud Rest, where in between ports of the main boss you do not really have that much of that. You have the time to cast Channeled Acceleration and keep it up for the whole time where the boss is stationary. But in general, in any other fight, using 2 global cooldowns for Channeled Acceleration loses you a cast on a spammable and a cast on Deep Fissure, which is, as you can see in the tooltip, a lot of damage that you use simply for getting 10% critical damage for a while out of it. And I found that it makes the rotation more complex, and in many cases leads to less DPS that you actually do in application. So I basically, on a dummy, I just don't use minor force at all. Of course you can say, yeah, you could at least cast Channeled Acceleration before the fight, so it lasts like 30 seconds into it and then just don't refresh it. Of course you can do that, but I just didn't want to include that element of RNG into my parses. So sure, you can do it. You can put it on the back bar where I have balance now, or you can put it here where the fissure is. But I don't use it a lot. I use it in Cloud Res. In Asylum, I actually don't, because it impairs your movement. And on a Warden, you're not really fast at all, so I don't really like it in there. And Rearming Trap is, yeah, sometimes also weird. And as I said, on Rearming Trap, you basically have to refresh it every rotation. And you lose a cast of shocks, for example, on it, or a spammable, which is a lot of damage. And critical damage, 10%, is not as much as it sounds because of the abundance of critical damage that you already have. I have 72% critical damage, and adding another like 10% on top of it, it's just like a damage contribution of 5 to 6% overall to what I have, which is not as much as it sound, which is basically not as much as the 10% make it sound in the beginning. So of course you can take this build. This is not an ultimately build that you have to use in this exact same rotation and stuff, but this is basically just to showcase how you can play Magicka Warden and how you can play it effectively enough to finish all content and get a lot of DPS out of it with a comparably easy rotation. In terms of, you can also look up other parses if you want to go into the high-end thing where you squeeze out that last little bit of DPS by adding more skills in. But that's not what this build is about. This is about applying it to actual raid scenarios where you have a lot of mechanics to deal with, where more complex rotations are actually very, very hard to keep up. And I see many people struggle with doing that and leading to less DPS and getting confused, and then they can't pay attention to mechanics. So this one is pretty much meant to keep it as simple as possible while keeping a certain level of effectiveness, which is usually in my DPS test is you can do 50k with orbs and berserk provided with it, which is definitely enough, and it will be amped up more in a raid because wardens do not have engulfing flames, they do not have minor prophecy, they do not have minor sorcery. So 50k without all of these buffs is pretty good. So let's continue with the back bar. Winter's Revenge, our ground AoE, definitely want to have that. It's very, very strong. As you can see in the parses, for example, here, Winter's Revenge, over 4k DPS in single target application. It's full AoE, it snares enemies in it. It's very strong, it deals frost damage, has a higher chance to apply chill to enemies and basically deal additional damage. So this is very nice to have. Elemental Blockade, the bread and butter skill of any Magicka build on the back bar paired with the Maelstrom Staff. Lasts 8 seconds, so you definitely want to keep this up. Burning enemies take 20% more damage from this ability, also very nice to have. The next one is another flex spot, which is the real beauty about this build, because you have basically 2 skills you do not need. These 2 skills you do not necessarily need, so you have room to put something there. Either Channeled Acceleration to get more critical damage in cases where you can use it. You can put something to heal here, like an AoE heal with Healing Seed to provide the synergy and minor toughness to allies. You can put in Cloud Res, for example, if you want to go downstairs, slot Trellis. No worries, you can do it. You can survive easily because this one has a heal over time attached to it, which keeps you alive, and a burst heal when you spam it. So this one is pretty much the best healing ability you can have downstairs in Cloud Res. Even better than a Nightblade, in my opinion. Nightblades have other advantages why they are used downstairs, which is the damage and the burst damage they have and the execute capability. But in terms of survivability downstairs, the Warden is pretty good. Then what you can also do is slot the armor buff here for your allies. You can put a shield here if you know that you're going to be hit by projectiles. Usually you shouldn't, but still it can happen. You can put the Frozen Gate here to chain in enemies for your tank if you want to help them out, and put like Major Maim. You can also, this one also has a morph that basically has a synergy attached to it, which allies can activate. You can put anything you want here on these 2 skills that basically help you out in the specific trial situation, because you don't need them to deal a lot of DPS on this build. You can also use Meditate if you need more resources. You can put Blood Altar, Energy Orbs, whatever you want on here is fine. Purge, again, you can also do. The next one is Inner Light. I basically put this on both bars simply for the max Magicka it provides. It is not necessary on the back bar. You can also, basically you have a third flex spot that you can fill with something else, but usually 2 flex spots are enough. You can put a shield and a heal here, for example, which is usually enough on a build. The ultimate that we double bar is the bear. This one is the highest single target DPS that we can get. It allows us to use Master Architect for Major Slayer. If you need more AoE, you can also front bar the Winter's Embrace ultimate, the Northern Storm, for 8% more max Magicka on the front bar, and on the back bar you can put down the Destro ultimate, this one, Elemental Rage, to get a lot of AoE in. If you don't use Master Architect, it's also very viable. You lose a little bit of single target DPS compared to this one, for example. Here you see that the bear almost provided, let's say 5k DPS in total, which is a lot, and the Destro ulti will not ultimately reach that. But it will still deal like 3 to 4k overall DPS, which is still fine. Let's get to CPs and Mundus stones. So CPs here are distributed usually, I won't go through the green and red CPs because they usually depend on which kind of content you do. So I'm only gonna go into the blue CP tree here. We have Elfborn, which gives us more critical damage and critical healing with magic abilities. I have 66 in here. The reason for this is that wardens have a lot of damage done in their class kit, which makes these and these points in here a little bit less beneficial. So I'm putting more into Elfborn and Spell Erosion because these are simply diminished by the high damage done that we have on the front bar on a Warden. The additional 15% is going to make these a little bit less effective past a certain border. So I usually put more into Elfborn. Then 56 Elemental Expert, solid, 12% damage increase to basically everything we do. Spell Erosion is 26. You can also take a few points out of here and put them elsewhere, depending on whether you can reach the penetration cap or not. You have to basically ask your group how you should distribute, how many points you need into Spell Erosion. Elfborn on a Warden is good because Wardens do not have any critical damage passive in their class, so getting them on a higher level is basically very helpful to get a solid critical damage value. Especially since we're not always using Minor Force on this build, it can help a lot. So here, Master at Arms, I put more points into this. Why is that? Because Wardens have quite a lot of direct damage. All the attacks that the bear does, Deep Fissure, the spammable, light attacks, all of these are direct damage. So if you have these available to you, you need to put more points into Master at Arms to boost the higher amount of direct damage compared to other classes. So I'm putting 66 points into Master at Arms and 10 points less into Thaumaturge. You still, in the abundance of CPs that you might have at full level, you can invest as many points. You can invest that many points into all of these trees that at some point it's very, very close together. No matter how distributed past the points of like 56, everything above that will usually not have that big of an impact. So this is just an example. I'm doing it this way because it simply yielded me the highest damage output in this distribution. As I said, it depends on the trial and the group whether you need more or less points into Spell Erosion, then you have to take a few points out of the others. Mundus wise, I'm going for the Thief with this build because all the sets we use do not really have any critical chance attached to it. Master Architect does not, Necropotence does not, Ceroria does not, no critical passive in here, and Spell Strategist also does not. If you use Mother Sorrow, it is not ultimately best to go for a different Mundus stone. It can still sometimes be the Thief. I have a sheet up on Alcast's website, or basically on the forums, where you can basically calculate, insert your critical chance, and then it will tell you whether Thief, Shadow, or Lover is the best for you. And I suggest using that if you don't know which Mundus stone you should go for. The other ones are generally subpar, simply because they do not boost all the damage you do. Critical chance and critical damage also benefit these two proc enchants that we have. So the Absorb Magic enchantment and the Fire enchantment are both gonna be increased by critical chance and critical damage. while, for example, the mage, the apprentice, these Mundus stones do not buff them. And they are a substantial part of our damage. When you look at this, these two here, it's 11% of the damage on this one, and on this one also over 9%. So it is a substantial part of damage, these enchants, and you choosing a Mundus stone that doesn't buff them is generally bad in that situation. So there's three options: the Thief, the Shadow, or the Lover, simply based on how strong enchantments are at this point. So either go for either one of these. Usually with all these non-critical damage sets, non-critical chance sets here, going for the Thief is the best option. So let's get to the rotation part. As I said, this rotation is more or less static. You have two things that are basically screwing up the staticness of the rotation, which is the Netch. It lasts 27 seconds, which doesn't really fit to the rotation overall. And we have the Eternal Guardian, which is you can usually cast roughly every 20 seconds when you look at the ultimate generation 3.5. So at 75 ultimate cost that you have on this when you want to cast it. It's roughly every 20 seconds you can cast this, which also doesn't fit to the static rotation we have, so we just fill it in between the shocks. The shocks are what we keep up as much as possible. So you have a 3-second timer on this. You have a little bit of margin for error, so as you can see here, I cast it a little bit early. The timer isn't on 0 yet, but there's a very narrow margin. You have to cast it in between 0.3 seconds of it running out to having it refresh, which makes the timer basically 3 seconds. Everything that is very close to that will allow you to recast it and still get the damage out of it. Now this ability has a 3-second timer, and when we look on the back bar, we have 1 damage over time effect lasting 12, 1 lasting 8, so it doesn't really time well with 3 seconds. Technically we could use 4 in a rotation of 12 seconds, or we could use 2 in a rotation of 8 seconds, but we're going to do the middle ground of that. So what we do is we cast this 3 times per rotation. So when we start the fight, what I usually do is I put it here. Basically what you do is you refresh the Netch pre-fight, then you cast a shock, and then on the back bar you start putting down your ground dots, and when you put down these 2 dots, you swap to the front bar again and cast the next shocks, Fetcher Infection, then the Bird or the Spammable, and then the next shock. So you always have 2 skills you can cast in between shocks. So the rotation you want to do is basically you cast the shocks, put down the ground dots with light attacks in between, then you can cast the next shocks, Fetcher, Bird, shocks, Bird, refresh the Netch, shocks. And then you go to the back bar again, because you see that blockade is already running out, but having it run out for 1 second isn't a problem in this build, because the tooltip of shocks is getting an additional shocks cast in is a lot stronger than having 1 additional tick of blockade, as you can see when you look at the tooltip. Basically blockade does roughly 2.6k damage, and the shocks have like almost 17k tooltip. So if you wanna, if you compare these two, it's pretty clear that the shocks win out. So that is also why we're doing 3 shocks with a 9-second rotation instead of 2 shocks with an 8-second rotation. So what we're doing is, again, cast shocks, bar swap, ground AoEs, and then you can cast the next shocks, put Fetcher up, Bird, shocks. You can use 2 birds if you have Netch up. Then the next shocks, and then you want a bar swap, put on ground dots again, and then you can activate the next shock. So this is basically how the rotation looks. You focus it entirely around the shock skill. What you cast in between is basically on the front bar is just keeping the Netch up, keeping the Fetcher Infection up, and casting the ultimate as soon as possible. The ultimate is the only ability that has a higher tooltip than the shocks. So this basically you can prioritize, but it's also not that big of a deal, because if you delay the shocks in your rotation, it can mess up the timing, and therefore I always prioritize the shocks and just use the ultimate the next time that I have time in between. If you want to see the rotation more in detail, you can basically just look at the parses and maybe play it in like half speed or something, so that you can basically get a grasp on how I do it. It's pretty easy. Just shocks, backbar dots, shock, fetcher, bird, shock, netch, bird, shock, backbar, put down the ground dots, shock again, fetcher, bird, shock, bird, bird, shock, backbar again, shock, fetcher, bird, shock, bird, netch, bird. And if you have the ultimate up, you can also fill that in between shocks. So it's not an entirely static rotation, but it's a very easy one because you only have to watch that one thing and the netch if it's up, and the rest basically at some point you do it automatically.